Welcome everyone to our Ethics Café. We will be focusing on managing duty to report and confidentiality in interprofessional settings. Want to begin with grounding ourselves in gratitude. I invite you to think about where you feel most connected to the land. And perhaps it is your garden, perhaps it's the beach, perhaps it's a hiking trail or a mountain. But take this moment of gratitude and really reflecting on what it is about the ground, the land that you are especially grateful for. So, for example, I am joining you from Unamagi. I never really appreciated the beauty of the fog until I moved here. Unamagi means land of fog, and indeed, as the fog rises from water to the sky, I have this understanding of the interconnection of everything in the universe. So that might be something I might share in the chat. Please feel free to use the chat to share your gratitude for the land where you are joining us from. And if you do not know the correct Indigenous name for where you are joining us from, like instead of saying I'm joining you from Halifax, which is the colonial name, I invite you to Google or look at placenames.mapdev.ca, which is a fabulous interactive map that you can use in order to find out and write the correct Indigenous name for where you are joining us from. And I am grateful to be on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. And as we pause in gratitude, we also give thanks for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Taking a deep breath and working on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. We are all treaty people, so how does this impact what we do and how we do it, and how can it guide our work together today? We especially recognize that those of us in the healthcare profession have unique calls to action from the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and we call these to mind and ground ourselves in them as well. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. And we recognize that all violence is interconnected and that is transforming who we are as social workers and who we are as healthcare providers in order to become safer. And that our code of ethics, in fact, for the Canadian Association of Social Workers was updated this year to encourage us to shift from the illusion of neutrality to actively becoming anti-racist and fighting against all forms of racism and intersectional prejudice that is part of colonization. And we recognize that becoming anti-racist is a journey from denial and fear to growing and unlearning. And that this is true not just for racism, but all forms of intersectional bias and all forms of prejudice. So decolonizing ourselves in our practice means recognizing the unique ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. Each of us, depending on our social location and intersectional positionality, are uniquely impacted or oppressed. For example, those of us from African descent were dispossessed and uprooted from their land and brought to Turtle Island against their will as part of the white supremacy and slave trade that fueled the settlement of this continent. And so we reflect on its impact upon each of us and our practice. And it is within this context that we are reflecting on our ethics cafe and specifically what it means to manage duty to report and confidentiality in the context within which we each might find ourselves, which usually and often are interprofessional settings. And that means that thinking about what it means to do duty to report means balancing ethical obligations, managing conflict and confidentiality, and understanding that different professions have different ways of thinking and knowing and being, and that our training has been in silos and we rarely come together to share and learn. And that is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful to have the Nova Scotia Health Ethics Network that is with us, Dr. Marika Warren, as well as we've got a doctor, a psychologist, community health, mental health worker, and a variety of other professions who are all joining us. And I am excited to first introduce Dr. Hawker, who is with us and who is going to help us begin thinking about how should we navigate, because this entire panel was created in part because of a situation where there was two different health professionals, a social worker and another health professional, that had a different idea of what duty to report meant. And one thought that we should report, and one thought that it was a confidentiality issue and we should not report. And it was from that conflict that this learning opportunity emerged. And so I honestly believe every time there's a conflict, there's learning that can happen. And the opportunity to dialogue together can help us think more clearly and expansively. And that is why I'm so grateful to have multiple different professions coming together to help us think about how to navigate these complex situations. And so, Dr. Hawker, I am grateful. We will begin with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nash. Yeah, I'm a family doctor by training with some additional training in addiction medicine. And I work at three clinical locations, all very fortunate to have social workers on site at each place. So I work with recently arrived refugees at the Newcomer Clinic. I work at the North End Community Health Center, which often provides care to kind of insecurely housed folks, a lot of African Nova Scotians who were moved from Africville to the North End neighborhood many years ago, and also a lot of kind of newly arrived Canadians and immigrants. And so it's quite a diverse practice, a lot of marginalized or vulnerable populations. And then my other location is an outpatient a withdrawal management unit. And so we see a lot of patients with addictions and many other kind of related vulnerabilities associated with that. So as you can imagine, confidentiality and duty to report comes up fairly regularly in my practice. I'll do a quick kind of overview of the different kind of standards and guidelines for physicians, and it does differ between different provinces. So depending on if you move to a different province and you're working with physicians in other locations, the rules might not be exactly the same as they are here. So for physicians, when we're struggling to determine the balance, things that we would look at are the CMPA. We have our malpractice physician advisors and legal advice that we can call and discuss. And we also have our college's guidelines and standards, which, for anybody else who's just really keen to read some kind of legalese, it's all available online. That can put you to sleep pretty quick. The Canadian Medical Association also has a code of ethics, not quite as new as the social work, but it's been rewritten in the last few years, so it's fairly up to date. So it's important to remember that improper disclosure of confidential health information really renders the physician vulnerable to discipline, both from the college, but also could be liable to like a civil action. So we have to take this duty to report quite seriously. When working in an interprofessional setting, it's clear from the college that even if we think it's been reported by another healthcare provider, that doesn't override our individual duty to report. So even if, say there was like a child that was being abused, and my nurse, Amy, already reported it, I would still have a duty to report that as well once I became aware of the situation. One of the kind of exceptions to the rule is a duty to report or a permission to warn if there's a danger to public safety. And so some of the key factors to determine if it meets the criteria is there's a clear risk, and sometimes that's really hard to determine. If there's an identifiable person or group of persons that are at risk, and if the risk is serious, so a serious risk of bodily harm or death. And I've had patients, say like, well, if you don't prescribe me whatever medication they're seeking, I'm going to go hurt somebody. That's different than I had one patient one time saying, I'm going to stab my husband. So it has to be a clear risk, an identifiable person that I could warn, either warn directly or warn via the police. And the danger has to be imminent, like I'm going to hurt this person, tonight or when I see them next. And when thinking about whether or not you're making the right decision, the rule is you have to think about, would a reasonable person with all of the facts that I have consider the potential for danger to be clear and serious and imminent. And if a reasonable person with the facts that you're given, then you would go ahead and report. And when you do report, you have to remember that you can't breach confidentiality any further than what that duty is. So sometimes if I'm talking to someone at DCS, for instance, where they're struggling with like alcohol use disorder, it was like a week or two ago, the worker was starting to ask lots of questions, and I have to only report what it is they need to know about the potential child at risk. And other questions beyond that, unless I really have like a signed consent from the patient saying like, yeah, tell them whatever they want because I'm trying to work with them and get my kids back. And then I can, tell them more about the prognosis and what treatments they've been doing and all the other things that DCS might be wanting to know about. We also have a duty to report if someone's unfit to drive. So that comes up often with addictions. It also comes up with a lot of our senior patients. I did a rotation in Lunenburg when I was a resident, and fortunately we had to take a lot of licenses away there. We had one patient that drove the wrong way down the divided highway, so that was kind of scary. If, as a physician, you don't report, and after making the determination that someone might be medically unfit, and that person actually does harm someone in an accident, you could be held liable for that accident, for that harm. And so most provinces in Canada have a mandatory duty to report, which is really protective for physicians. Nova Scotia, we have a discretionary report, which makes it a little bit more challenging. But the college registrar has been very clear that if you had reasonable grounds to suspect that the person may not be medically fit to drive, then that's sufficient. It's not the physician determining whether or not there is abuse. It's not the physician determining whether or not the person's fit or not fit to drive. If you have reasonable grounds that there's concern, that's when you would make a report to motor vehicles. BC is an interesting province in that the doctors only report if they've already told the patient not to drive and they become aware that the patient continues to drive. I haven't found anything in Nova Scotia about what to do in that scenario, but it has come up for me maybe twice, and I've just reported a second time, just saying, just so you know, I've reported this a year ago, and I've been recently made aware that the person continues to drive, and I have significant concerns. Let's see what else. The Canadian Medical Association also has a driver's guide for driving. So when it comes to little ones, depending on the province, the definition of a child can differ. Nova Scotia is one of the ones that has a broader age. It's under 19, whereas some other provinces are a little bit less than that. Department of Community Services, they have an after hours number, which I use not infrequently because usually this is the kind of thing that you can't do during a busy clinic, so you end up calling the after hours number to do that later. When it comes to children, for me, it's not usually like frank child abuse. It's more of this child's in need of protection, or I'm concerned that they're in need of protection. And in Nova Scotia, where it's mandatory, for anyone under 19, if I fail to report it, I'm actually, failure to report is actually an offense, a criminal offense. And so that's quite serious. And in terms of abuse, there's the more obvious physical and sexual, but there's also emotional and verbal, and also witnessing abuse. So that's one that comes up not infrequently. So the patient or the child is not being directly abused, although in my experience, usually if one of the partners is being abused with intimate partner violence, often the children is really high risk for it as well. So even if that hasn't happened yet, if they're witnessing that abuse, that that counts in terms of the duty to report. So a physician that makes a report in this scenario, they are protected against legal action, provided it was made with a reasonable cause. So again, sometimes peds emerge docs, like they see an unusual injury or something. It might have been a weird fall from a trampoline, but it's not their job to determine that. There's a specific team that looks into that. If they have a reasonable concern, then they would make the report. We also have some other ones that don't come up nearly as often, but if we're concerned about another physician's ability to practice safely, we have duty to report that. We have quite a long list of communicable diseases that we have a mandatory reporting, and depending on the severity of the communicable disease, the mandatory reporting might be, within a couple hours, 24 hours to a few days, and we just report that directly to public health. I have quite a few vulnerable seniors in the North End who have been in need of protection. So similar to child abuse or children in need of protection, all the same factors, but also financial abuse sometimes can occur too. And it differs between provinces, but in Nova Scotia, it's mandatory as well. A few other ones that come up occasionally, we have to mandatory reporting of drug diversion, or if someone steals your prescription pad or alters a prescription. I had that happen once. It was like dispensing way more pills than I would ever dispense, so the pharmacist knew something was up. And then one time another physician couldn't find their pad, and so they wrote a prescription on my pad, and then the pharmacist was like, this isn't her handwriting, that's not her signature. And I first thought somebody stole my pad, but it actually was okay. For about an hour, I was a little worried. And then we also have some reportable deaths, like gunshot wounds and workplace injuries. But the biggest thing I would say is a takeaway, especially when working in teams, it's nice to work as a team, because then you can really try to figure out what would a reasonable person with the information that we have. And again, you don't have to determine for sure, but you have to have a reasonable suspicion. And if you do, you can seek counsel, the Health Ethics Network, CMPA, the Code of Ethics from various organizations, but also document very clearly. So if there is ever a complaint or question come up about it, you know exactly what was said and what was not said, and the time of when it was released and that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions or chat more about it.
Thank you so very much. We are very grateful to have you, and now to have Natasha, who's going to share from a different perspective. And again, this is bringing everyone together. The chat is a great place for dialogue and questions, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end, but we're going to have a couple of case studies. But over to you, Natasha. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone and Dr. Hawker for going through that perspective. It adds lots of layers. And when we come together like this, it's always a great opportunity to learn. And so I'm speaking as a psychologist who works in a school environment. So that adds a different layer again, because we're always on teams as part of the education system with social workers and speech language pathologists and teachers and administrators, and multiple layers of interacting with children from pre-primary level all the way up to grade 12. And so we see a lot of different people and different family aspects and community aspects as well. As psychologists, though, we have our Canadian Code of Ethics that's determined by the Canadian Psychological Association. I'm not sure it's been updated quite so recently because it's 2017. And that is an overarching code of ethics that provides us with like 4 principles that we have to abide by. Respect for dignity of persons and peoples, the responsible caring and integrity in relationships, responsibility to society. And so in terms of an overarching code of ethics that really protects the field of psychology, the practice of psychology, and the persons seeking psychological services. So that's kind of what we all must abide by. But within the province of Nova Scotia, psychologists become registered under the Nova Scotia Board of Examiners in Psychology. And within that world, we have standards of practice, so standards of professional conduct. And again, it's both to protect the public, but also to protect the profession. And so, as I said, from my experience, a lot of the pieces around confidentiality and establishing informed consent when we're working with students or families, we cover those pieces right up front so that people are aware if we're coming in to the picture, we're going to get our informed consent process completed. And within that, we always discuss confidentiality in terms of when must we have limitations in what we're able to keep confidential. And so there are psychologists obviously working in many, many fields throughout the province. And my experience has been within school and private. And so when we go over those limits to confidentiality and when we may need to share information, we talk about the obligations around duty to report. So if we suspect that a child, someone under the age of 19, has been harmed or has potential for being harmed, that's a limit to the confidentiality we will provide. Also, if we are subpoenaed to go to court, then we would have to share information from whatever, or if it's an assessment, it's a report, or what have you. So those limits are covered right up front when we're doing our informed consent. But now I'm going to switch gears and talk more to my experience working with situations where the duty to report has become evident. Something's happened, a child said something is suspected, and then it feels like people go into panic mode. Like, I don't know what to do. Like, what are we supposed to do? And so it's always take a deep breath, find your team, and usually it involves for the education system. As a psychologist, we usually recommend you have your administrator and you get people that are important to the situation to be able to kind of help guide through the process. So we'll make a phone call on behalf of a teacher who's sitting in the room with us, or will be present to support the person making the call. There seems to be a lot of worry and concern when calls are made, but we always just reassure we are doing this in the best interest of a child. So as Nova Scotians, we all have a duty to report. And even like Dr. Hawker said, even if there's multiple people with the information, every one of us has that duty. So within our professions, we follow our codes of ethics, but even just as a normal everyday human being in Nova Scotia, we have that duty to report as well. And so making those calls, even when we're maybe a little unsure, we always do the pieces of trust the child, trust the knowledge that the child has provided, document, like Dr. Hawker said, document time, call, who's in the room, who has the information, and always report on what we've done. So making sure that we have an understanding of we followed these steps. And oftentimes when those reports are made, there seems to be a long time where we don't have information. And so that can be also very frustrating for people after they've made a report to not know what has happened. And so again, there's a lot of pieces that if you've never gone through that, having the opportunity to know that there's a network somewhere where we can contact, like this is news for me and I'm And I'm always grateful for these gatherings because those provide so much learning opportunities. Because unfortunately, even within our disciplines as a psychologist, even our work is so siloed. So even like my work as a school-based psychologist is very siloed compared to someone in the health profession, like in a hospital setting or in a clinic setting. So grateful to Naj and this network of professionals coming together. So thank you. And I look forward to questions as well.
Thank you so very much. And thank you for helping us understand why it's so important for us to dismantle silos to ensure safer care for everyone. I don't know that Alec needs any introduction, but very grateful to Alec to share the social work perspective.
Great. I'm so happy to be here, everyone, to talk about this issue. It's one that the college has answered many questions on, as well as raised some critical structural issues with as well. So I'm gonna take some time, I won't take too much, but just to look at this from a couple of perspectives. So social work, from an ethical standpoint, has a number of oftentimes competing objectives. Always best interest of the client, service user, child is primary, but social workers also have obligations towards equity and social justice, which factor into these decisions as well. So starting from that structural level, we have to look at the context of the Children and Family Services Act, which was passed in 2017. And there were many challenges with the amendments to the Act in 2017. In particular, the broad definitions of a child in need of care, particularly how neglect is defined. Neglect is defined in the Act as a child experiencing poverty. In addition to that, what the Act put in place was a number of different thresholds for a duty to report. There's a generalized duty to report in which if any Nova Scotian has any information or believes that a child might be in harm, they have a general duty to report. What the Act also did, as we've mentioned here today, is put a higher level of reporting for professionals and also put provisions that a failure to report could lead to a summary conviction, which is pretty tough language and set a really, in my opinion, dangerous context for how we deliver care and services to our most vulnerable. When you look at the research around duty to report, particularly when there's a mandatory duty to report, the research is pretty consistent that it does not impact the quality of care to vulnerable people. It doesn't impact the outcomes in child welfare. What it does do is enhance and increase the over-surveillance of already vulnerable, marginalized people and forces them into, again, situations where they're now under investigation, particularly for instances of poverty. This cannot be lost in our context of when we are looking to apply our duty to report, nor can we negate the fact that it is the law, that we do have to. So this becomes the bind that many professionals find themselves in. Is we always have a legal, the threshold in the Children and Family Services Act makes it mandatory, and you can be held legally responsible for not. That doesn't negate our ethical responsibilities as social workers to best interest of child, to social justice, to equity, and to those other issues. So it is a constant, of course, negotiation. And I know, we've been in these sessions before, and Marika and I have both talked about finding the least worst option is often the ethical dilemma that we find ourselves in. And that's a tough negotiation. Now, although there's always a legal obligation, there are factors that can start to be factored in on how and when and what it looks like to report. For instance, in the Social Work Code of Ethics, both new and old, self-determination and confidentiality are still primary. And again, social workers have moved to viewing our ethical framework through a co-relational lens and an intersectional lens. So we look at co-creating meaning together with service users, recognizing again that both are experts Ultimately, the client is the expert of their own life and brings that unique experience to the situation. And a social worker is an expert in care and provisions of how we care for the vulnerable. Together, a co-creation of meaning of the situation is desirable. Working towards self-determination and empowerment are also issues that we want to try and face and strive towards. And so in this dilemma, there's always a negotiation and considerations to be made. How will this impact my therapeutic relationship with the client? Are there ways that I can mitigate that concern in terms of how we address this or work together? What are the impacts of breaking down that therapeutic relationship? Is there other care provision that can happen in that regard? What might be the perceived consequences of making this report? Ultimately, again, if a child is in need and needs intervention, most professionals, as Dr. Hawker has pointed out, operate from what would a reasonable person think in this matter, and it can make a determination from there in terms of if a child is in need of those protective services. Ultimately, again, it's really important that we keep in mind that we do have a legal obligation and that there are steps we need to take to try and mitigate the ethical tensions that exist, keeping primary best interest of the client, confidentiality, self-determination, and ultimately social justice, addressing those equity issues, and recognizing again that there may be an inherent unfairness in the act that you can address with your clients. It's totally appropriate to say there are structural issues that are occurring here. This is the bind that I am in. And having those conversations as well. And then also working to address those structural issues. The Act is currently under review. If you haven't sent a letter to the Department of Community Services and the minister, then ultimately, again, you have the opportunity to do that. And you might be able to do that with your service user as well to strengthen that in terms of an advocacy point of view. Ultimately, again, it's upon social workers to be able to use their judgment, make assessments, and ultimately mitigate the risks to the clients in terms of that legal obligation to report, while also recognizing that we do have a duty to social justice and addressing unfair, unjust laws. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure that we'll have some good conversation as we continue to move forward.
Thank you so very much. She has already had some introductions, but this is Dr. Marika Warren, crowd favorite here at the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. And I'll let you introduce yourself because you can do it better than I.
Perfect. And I also just hate introductions generally for all sorts of reasons. But I'm Marika Warren. I'm the network ethicist with the Nova Scotia Health Ethics Network, which is a collaboration between Nova Scotia Health, IWK Health, and the Nova Scotia Department of Health and Wellness that I frame as being a warm hug around the ethics supports that exist within those organizations. And in terms of access to the resources of the network, we have a number of online resources on our website that just was made much nicer at nschen.ca. Also, Google will get you there. And then through each of our collaborating partners, there's ways into the ethics support there that then will reach us. So in terms of a lot of what Alec just said, I just co-sign all of that, both in terms of the real tensions that exist and sort of the strategies for managing them, none of which will necessarily feel satisfying. I often like to say that by the time you need to get us involved as ethics support, the option of good feelings at the end of the day has often left the building long ago, and we really are in that sort of harm mitigation place. So I think one of the things I wanted to discuss, duty to report questions are also perennial for us in ethics as well for a number of reasons. Again, there's some fairly fundamental values in tension, and it's not always clear how we balance them out. And so I think the previous speakers have spoken nicely to sort of that existence when we're talking about interaction with clients, patients, and service users. And so I wanted to focus a bit on some of the work that we tend to try and do when that disagreement is within a team and there are folks with sort of differing senses of what to do, because that can be very challenging for the team. So thinking about sort of our role in some of the reduction in, for example, moral distress that folks can feel in these sorts of scenarios. So a lot of what we do is going to be trying to dig down and get at what is the source of the disagreement. So, when we disagree about values, we tend to hold them very close to ourselves, both personally and professionally. So it can be challenging to sort of do some of that deep dive conversation to figure out what is it that we're disagreeing about here. But it's often very useful to be able to figure out, is it that different members of the team have different information that they are using? And then this is where some of those questions around confidentiality arise. And again, how much can legitimately be shared in the sort of pre-reporting discussion or in making that decision about whether or not the threshold for reporting has been met. And again, that's a grayer area than when you hit the point of reporting and then there's legislation that indicates that that need to avoid harm is going to reduce some of the obligations that would normally be in place around confidentiality. But as we've heard, there's also different codes of ethics, and they're sort of a flower of overlapping petals and touch on a number of very similar things in their core, but they also have different valences around. And so when, again, those codes of ethics that are really central to members of the team and their sense of professional integrity, and there can be differences there in terms of either specific values that are identified or the way that those values are balanced in a particular code of ethics or how they're prioritized. And so when, again, you're coming up against those, how to identify and then navigate some of those discussions. There can also be just differing, even within professions, different understandings of what a particular value means in this context. So ethics is always very much about the specific context that we find ourselves in. And codes of ethics are lovely documents, but it's asking too much of them to provide very direct guidance in every specific situation that a professional might face. So there's always that interpretive work going on. And so trying to, again, just really articulate, how are we understanding these values? What do we think it means? And what about the situation might shift that for everyone involved? And then finally, when we're talking about risk in a lot of these, is there a reasonable risk, likely danger? This is the language coming again from the legislation. And so that risk assessment is also always value laden as well. And again, acknowledging the ways that our personal and professional values come into those assessments. It doesn't mean that we're all going to, again, wind up on the same page at the end of that conversation and singing in 10-part harmony. But if we have that appreciation of where everyone else is coming from, again, it can help us have more productive disagreement and feel heard in the conversation, even if at the end of the day you still might have questions about the final decision and where it landed one way or the other. I think another thing about, again, the particular social work aspect around duty to report is the way that social workers are often located at the interface of the health system and the other systems that then come into play once reporting is made, whether that be adult protection or child protection or other services, and are often very aware of sometimes the lack of resources or support or really ability of some of those services. Again, despite their best intentions, there are no mustache twirling villains in this scenario, but the resources are very scarce. And there are times when people have legitimate concerns around, I understand I have a duty to report to try and prevent harm. And this again speaks to some of that evidence that Alec mentioned, but I also know that if I report, the resources aren't there to prevent that harm, and that there are very real harms that can result from reporting, particularly in terms of the relationship with the healthcare system as a whole, as well as with individual providers. And so, I'm doing a thoughtful, ethical, real cost benefit analysis here. And I recognize, in the default scenario, why this obligation exists. But in this case, it really seems counterproductive. And I know that folks, again, especially social workers, but not exclusively social workers, really struggle with those sorts of questions. So we've had a number of sort of deeper engagements with folks at IWK where these questions come up frequently, particularly around children and youth, where it's been a co-presentation between myself and legal and professional practice to really try and get sort of all of those perspectives in. And we've got, it's been I think a useful collaboration for folks to hear all those perspectives at once. And for folks who are at IWK or have access to their resources on Pulse Legal's put together a sort of guide for legal and ethical perspectives on duty to report. So both a sort of good parts version of the legislation, so that you don't need to wade through it all, but also, again, those sort of ethical pieces, which really speak to the fact that from an ethics perspective, it's not just what we do it, but also how. And so, again, thinking about if I recognize, or we've landed at a place where we've decided we are going to report, that it's still that how do we do it in the least harmful way possible? How do we, again, minimize confidentiality that we need to breach? How are we transparent about what we're doing and why? How do we try to maintain relationships where it's possible or appropriate to do so? How do we validate concerns that patients or service users may have about what's going to happen? But I will say that I have been involved in cases where reporting was necessary, and sort of going in thought that this is going to end very badly for everyone, and it sort of set my expectations appropriately given the context. But we were able to have a very long discussion, but a very useful discussion, where at the end of the day, reporting still happened, and yet the team felt supported, that they were able to provide care that respected their professional integrity, and the parents were able to appreciate where the team was coming from, and again to still engage in care. Sort of anyhow, so it actually turned out really well. That was one where there was nice singing at the end of the consult when it really wasn't expected. So also being open to the possibility that trying to do these things well actually can make it better. And certainly overall, even when it doesn't go well, we're really looking to provide that sense of being heard from that values place of integrity, in hopes that that helps to reduce or manage some of the moral distress that often is associated with these sorts of situations. So I will end there for now. And again, thank you, Naj, for organizing this. Thank you for all the panelists. Again, it's so rich when we all come together, and it feels like it's a great braid that we're creating here with, again, all the perspectives in it. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. And I am excited to now introduce Allison, who's going to help us think about what this looks like in the real world, because we had a chance to hear the theoretical multiple perspectives, but now we have a chance to think about some possible theoretical scenarios. So Allison, over to you. Thank you so much for being here and helping us think about this in a practical way.
Thanks so much, Naj. I really appreciate the invite. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm excited to learn from the professionals who are attending this panel today. So thank you so much. I just put my introduction in I'm not an introduction person either, so I just popped it into the chat if anybody is interested. But yeah, so I work in housing, and I work with a coordinated access system, and so we're just building a network, really, of professionals who come to the table in our area to sort of case conference about housing resources and how we get people connected. So in this line of work and in my previous work with places of safety, there have been so many instances where people are in situations that just seem incredibly not even just tough, but very impossible almost. And so I've come up with sort of a scenario, and just keeping in mind that although this is hypothetical, it draws on my experience from the field. And so these are situations that I've encountered at least once. So I'll just go through a scenario with you that that folks might be able to work through, and maybe if you could provide some advice, or if you could speak to how this might play out from a social worker's perspective, that would be really helpful to me, and I'm sure to others on in the chat there as well. Yeah, so and this is also a scenario that speaks to the interpretive work that Marika was talking about as well. So gets right on par, I think, with that. So this is a very complex situation, and I know that it's nitpicky and it's got a lot of complex things, and it's really impossible to impose a whole policy that will encapsulate everybody's particular situation. And I appreciate that. And I'm really hoping to learn how we can get some advice about how to pursue the right path for this. So without further ado, this is my scenario. So in a situation, a mother has a history with childhood abuse and abusive partners. She escapes her situation and lives on a couch with a family member. One of her children has opted to live with her, and that child has their own room in the house, but the mom doesn't. If she reached out to a housing support agency, they might help her with applying for housing subsidy, priority access form to the Nova Scotia Provincial Housing Authority, grocery cards, among other things. But she becomes very overwhelmed with the idea that her child or children might be seen as unhoused and withdraws her consent. She's now at risk of losing her coaching situation, and the family members, as the family member's situation is changing that she's staying with, and so she's her plan is to move back with an abusive ex. So some things that make this situation a little complex are that she is in core housing need, but she's only making $16 an hour. So entering into this specific market in this moment, absolutely not an option. There's nothing on the market for her. She requires a housing support worker, but doesn't want to sign a release of information. She wants to remain at her workplace because she trusts the owner and has been well accommodated there. She believes she has PTSD and or autism spectrum disorder, but can't afford the time or the money to get assessed, and also fears that they may take her children. A diagnosis would also help her financially, as she would be eligible for disability tax benefit. Her experience with DCS has heightened her anxiety, so her parenting style becomes a little more severe, a little more critical when she feels they may become involved. So she may become a little more strict, which could have a different effect on the children altogether. And she has no way of obtaining her child tax benefit for her child without disclosing her situation. And she requires that money to move into a space where all of her children can be housed with her. So this situation, so if this woman reaches out, how can we better her financial situation and potentially house her without getting DCS involved? Or if it's not an option, would she risk losing her children if we do reach out? And how can we navigate this for her while reassuring her that our parenting won't come into question and that she'll maintain her connection with the supports that she needs?
Thank you so very much for sharing that real world example. I love how we were talking about how ethics is really about harm mitigation or harm reduction, or just trying to find the best of the least worst scenario. So I open it up to our professionals who are here. You want to offer a couple of initial thoughts? I don't know, Dr. Hawker, if you wanted to get us started. I see though, Alec, you have unmuted, so I don't know if you're wanting to go first. I'll let you all start it for yourself.
I'm happy to just add some context, and then we can go from there. I mean, I think that in terms of a duty to report, the first thing that really needs to be established is what is the immediate risk here and who might be involved in that risk. Again, if this person has not moved back into an abusive home, then that risk is not imminent and you have some time. Through that time, that's where you start to utilize your relationship to start to advance the interests of this family in a way that's meaningful. Again, we know there's lots of resource issues. We know there's, a lot of barriers in terms of finding that safe housing in the current situations that we exist in. So part of the process that I would utilize is working with the family to determine what are the strengths? What are the points of resilience? What is the safety mechanisms that we can start to employ here to start to mitigate some of those apparent risks? Ultimately, as I mentioned in my preamble, it's always a negotiation and a co-creation of that meaning in terms of how we move forward, trying to ensure that confidentiality, self-determination, and empowerment are all present in these decisions. Ultimately, again, if you're this family is in a situation where they are returning to a situation where, and again, we have to look at the definitions of a child in need of care within the Act again. The definition for domestic violence is also in the Act is also quite controversial. In that it does read that it's not just being exposed to violence. It's again, knowing of violence that occurred in the home, and that one incident is enough for intervention. Again, women's shelters, when the Act was being adopted, talked about the real double jeopardy that puts them in terms of service provision, in that it does force folks to in that situation where they may have to make a report based on the fact that the child was aware of violence that happened in the home, which of course compromises the ability to care. So in sum, I think it is always a matter of recognizing when you might be forced with the obligation of making a report, and recognizing that there are steps that can be taken before that needs to happen, and then working to build the resiliencies and the safety mechanisms that the family has at their disposal to try and mitigate some of those imminent risks while trying to facilitate that self-determination and empowerment and co-creation of meaning.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to go? Dr. Hawker, yes.
I'll just say, usually if this comes up at the North End Community Health Center, we start with adding the name to our CPR meeting. So it's not like, chest compressions, it's complex patient rounds. So as a team, regularly we get together and sit around, does anybody have any, cases they want to discuss? And then you can bring the case forward and you get the perspective of the social work, shared care mental health nurse. Sometimes we have internal medicine addictions there. We have dietitians, we have housing workers, we have like a slew of kind of health professionals, and we can all kind of brainstorm. So just off the top of my head, with this particular case, as a physician, I'm going to be trying to explore the PTSD symptoms and possibly make a diagnosis. Hopefully start some treatment, whether it's counseling and or medication, to try to improve her mental health stability, and that will improve her parenting skills as well, probably. We'd be booking the child in for a well child visit, just to kind of assess how they're doing. If they meet criteria for disability tax credit or any other kind of government funding that she might qualify for, between the doc and the social worker would be trying to kind of maximize any sort of financial support she can get. We have housing support workers at the North End Community Health Center. We're really fortunate to have that. So we'd be getting support from them as well. And just to try to stretch your budget further, we'll often book with a dietitian to talk about like how to cook, kid-friendly meals on a budget. We have a good food box program. You get this big paper bag of lots of fruits and veggies for like $7. There's a pantry program for kids' snacks at school. So there's lots of support that we would just try to, sometimes it's a little overwhelming for the patient sometimes, but we really try to wrap it around. And like Alex said, we may or may not have time on the duty to report depending on the specific circumstance, but it sounds like in this case, we probably would have some time to hopefully really support this person and put in some safety mechanisms so that we could possibly avoid that. Normally in scenarios like this too, where the patient, had a lot of adverse childhood events, probably didn't have the best modeling of parenting, and then they're living, just struggling to survive. And so they're in like a stress response. So it's very hard to parent when that's your foundation and that's your kind of current environment. So trying to support that, but also connecting with things like Strongest Families or other ways for kind of building better skills for parenting going forward too.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to offer some reflections? Yes, Natasha.
Just very, very similar to Dr. Hawker in terms of looking at the ASD piece for mom. So those are opportunities that there are some psychologists in the province that offer pro bono services. So we could connect mom to services to maybe explore that diagnosis, because again, we can also support with the tax benefit components of that as well. I think that, you know, as mentioned, there are pieces within, from my world, the school that can support that. We have backpack programs that go home with food and supports like that. So again, just building up some pieces around making sure mom and child are good, and making sure that if we can mitigate going back to that abusive X space, that we would do what we need to do to support that as well.
I think the only thing I'd want to throw in there in our last few moments is really to like validate and acknowledge the experience and the concern and worry about DCS involvement. And I think there are likely to be some ethical questions that come up for the care providers around not making promises that, okay, well, if we just do this, then I guarantee you that DCS won't get involved. And I know that that sort of betrayal often happens when you get a lot of people involved, and someone has said, like if we sort out the living situation, then that will, take away this risk and it'll be fine. And then someone else involved, again, has that differing interpretation of their obligation, and then does make the report, or someone in the community, and that can be really, really devastating, especially given the history there. So I think, again, in terms of thinking about, outcomes and ethics, that sort of transparency and in a way that really supports the self-efficacy and the autonomy of the parent here. So here's what I can do. Here's the costs and benefits, and your fears are legitimate. And at the end of the day, you've demonstrated here a lot of skills, a lot of resilience. That she's still employed despite sounds like a very tenuous living situation, for example. Again, speaks, I think, volumes. And so, how to really support her in feeling that she's in control of the situation to a certain degree, and that, again, some of that decision about reporting will sort of depend on what she does. And really, again, that sort of co-creation and collaborative relationship, I think, is and rooting response in that. Again, that's challenging when you might have that, but there's a whole other team that's involved, or there's a whole host of other teams that you might not have contact with. So again, incredibly complex situation where you're looking for the least harm that we're going to do, or the least harm that we're going to perpetuate in the situation, and then go from there. And just to tie in also the comment in the chat around just the huge problem about the whole framework in which this is happening, just huge cosign on that. And again, those pieces around advocacy are really key in terms of addressing the moral distress that you feel that you've done everything you can, even if it, again, doesn't necessarily feel like it's changing things in the moment, that having done that makes a significant difference in terms of your ability to deal with the next client who has also a whole host of complex systemic challenges facing them.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all your answers. I have a lot to think about and a lot of reading, I think, to do. Yeah, I appreciate the complexity of the situation. Makes it very difficult to work in a context where you're trying to apply a certain framework to something. But I think the case conferencing is really pinnacle, and it's very important. So I think I might, actually pursue that a little bit more. Thank you so much. I appreciate your help.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And really, as I'm thinking about this, that the CPR, I love that as a term, complex patient rounds, because it's really focusing on prevention in an interprofessional and collaborative way. And the truth is, we need a lot more places like Northern Community Clinic all across the province, so that we can have these alternative models to care that look at prevention and wellness and are rooted in community and in lived experience. Because otherwise, when we're in our silos, that's when we're insecure. And that's when we sometimes are because of colonization, afraid of punishment, where maybe there's this perfectionism, do it right. I might over-report when I'm uncertain, or I might over-promise and be like, no, 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 I'm going to protect you because of the binary. I'm either on one side or I'm on the other. And, you know, the criminalization of poverty, the ways in which our systems are deeply, deeply entrenched in racism and colonization. And yet we also do have to be protecting the most vulnerable. And all of us who are providing care, regardless of our professional training or background, we're all in this work because we want to make a difference and help people. And it's really, really complicated, but thankfully we are not alone. And this is just one amongst our many interprofessional education series. I'm deeply grateful to all of our panelists. Want to also just take this moment to remind everyone the Nova Scotia Health Ethics Network, while it is primarily focused on the more immediate healthcare environment, it is a resource in our province that many of us don't know, that brings together multiple perspectives that I have a dream is going to expand beyond the hospital, as indeed all healthcare should. It should be expanded to look at all of the continuum of wellness activities in an interprofessional and collaborative way. And I am going to keep advocating. We put in the chat, the Nova Scotia Legal Information Society has We Have Power website that we co-created with them, so that you can advocate to your MLA. You can do what Alec recommended as well and advocate for changes to the larger structural issues that are affecting us, and then recognizing when we have ethical dilemmas, it means that the system has already put us in this place where we feel sandwiched between our professional obligations and our moral and ethical considerations, and recognizing there is no right way. So becoming aware and engaging in dialogue and reaching out to other people so that we can ensure that our own stuff isn't getting in the way of seeing clearly what is really involved. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone joining us. And we hope to see you again as we continue to learn and unlearn and co-figure out together a better way forward that ensures safer and braver care for everyone. With deep gratitude to everyone.